So my Cub Low Boy the other day, this is a 154, it was tugging right along and all of a sudden it just stopped pulling. The engine was running good. I had a gear shift, I could shift through the gears, but it just wasn't pulling. And basically what has happened is the clutch has given out. Now, I've already done a little bit of exploratory here to take a look and see what's going on. But if you take a look, when you spin the shaft, you can see down here that the spline stays still, the coupler stays still, but if you look at the edge here where the actual friction plate is, it spins with the actual clutch itself. So there is a problem here, and my guess is the clutch center here has broken free from the friction plate, and that's why we're not getting any grip and we can't go. So we need to change this, but the big problem with the Cub 154, the early models are, if you take a look, this has one where the pulleys are not attached to the flywheel, which means the only way to change this clutch is to unbolt the engine and scoot it forward just a little bit so you can pull the spline out of the backside of this clutch to replace it. Now over here is a newer model. This is a 185, and you can take a look and see that the pulley is attached to the flywheel. There's basically a bolt right up here that you can unbolt, and the shaft will slide back into the flywheel, allowing you to access and replace the clutch. This didn't happen until the later model Cub Lowboys, so you kind of get what you get. The early models are just a little more difficult to change. Now, I've leafed through the service manual, and it looks like they want you to take quite a few parts and pieces off this thing and able to get the drive shaft forward. But I'm kind of studying it over, and I really don't think it's as complicated as it looks in the manual. Now, I printed out the service manual. If I can find a link to this, I'll put it down below in the description. I'll also put a link down below in the description of any other parts and pieces I use to change this clutch out. Maybe that'll help you out a little bit. I actually buy most things from Hamilton Bob's. Some stuff I can find on Amazon and eBay. But back at the project here, I've taken the belts off. I basically just unloosened the adjuster here, pulled the nuts off, rolled it forward, popped the belts off the PTO. I started to disconnect it from here, and I just don't think we need to do any of that. I do think that we need to loosen up some bolts down here on the bottom to hold this front bearing in. I'll show you that here. If you look right down in here, there's a couple of bolts. There's a bolt here, and there's one down here. Can't see that too well. I think when we unbolt that, then this drive shaft is free of everything from here on back. We should be able to unbolt the bolts from the engine. So there's one here. I believe there's actually 6 of them. I haven't found them all yet, but there's some down in here too. And then probably this hydraulic line will have to be disconnected, and then maybe we'll be able to scoot the entire engine forward just enough to be able to service the clutch. So at this point, I was able to move the engine forward about 3/4 of an inch. It is not enough. I'll show you back here in a little bit what's going on and how much more we have to move the engine. A couple things just to make note of. There is a couple of bolts here, and they hold the back of this pan to the back of the engine. You do have to unbolt those. Other than that, it was a matter of unbolting the bolts here, and respectively on the other side. Pretty much freed up the engine. I was able to scoot it forward until the oil pan hit the cross member. So you can see right here, the oil pan is bumped up against this cross member. Now I think I can unbolt that cross member. It's just 2 bolts right now holding it on, and that might free up enough that I can scoot the engine forward a little bit more. Now I do kind of have a better idea of what's going on. I was able to pull some of this apart with that 3/4 of an inch, and I scooted the engine forward. It's not enough to pull the friction plate out, but you can see the friction plate has kind of come detached from the spindle there. So that is our problem, and we do have a new friction plate, so not a big deal. All right, so the cross member is now unbolted, and I was able to scoot the engine up a little bit more. We have a little bit of more look in here, but we still do not have enough room to service this. So we have to scoot the engine forward at least another inch, probably a little more. And now what's holding us up is the cross member down here. So the flywheel is hitting the backside of the cross member. So we need to drop this cross member out, and we'll see what we got after that. All right, so with this cross member dropped out, it's kind of more of a little tin pan there. It protects the bottom of the flywheel and protects things from hitting it while it's moving. But I've got it out. That allowed me to move the engine forward almost enough, and I kept fighting it, and then it dawned on me that the gas tank is actually bolted to the engine. So your options are to unbolt that bolt there or loosen up the straps, which is what I did, and now there is plenty of room to service the clutch. Now, comparing the old one to the new one, they look to be exactly alike. Again, Hamilton Bob's, the link will be down below. And you can see what happened to this one. The center broke out of it. If you look at it, it's kind of interesting. You can see some rust spots along the edges. So odds are this had been cracked a while, and then it just kind of gave out the last time I used it. Now we just got to work the new clutch back in and get it all adjusted. With the engine moved forward, I was able to slip the new clutch down, tighten everything back up, and I've now slid the engine back this way. As you can see, it actually came back pretty easy, not a big deal there, and everything kind of lined up and just seemed to go where it needed to go. I did take this time to go ahead and grease the bearing down in here. There's a Zerk fitting right underneath here. I had to pull the pin and move it back. I also took all the bolts and I made sure I used some never seize, because quite honestly, when you break off a rusted bolt, it kind of ruins your day. So anytime I manage to miraculously get the bolts off without breaking them, I put a little never seize on them, put them back in. So it's good stuff, well worth the investment. So now it's a matter of just tightening all the bolts down, reconnecting all the linkages, and putting the bolts back in the engine, putting the cross members back underneath the engines, retightening the straps on the gas tank, and also putting the bolts back in the bearing that's holding this coupler here. And then on the other side, we need to reconnect the hydraulic lines and any other lines that we've loosened up, and then we should be ready to test this clutch out, or at least get the clutch adjusted. Now, there's a couple things going on with this particular clutch design that I don't think a lot of people understand, and that is there's a clutch brake right here. Now, there's a couple, what I think they call them button pads, but they're basically round cylinders that sit inside here and here, two of them, and as this plate pulls backwards, it rubs on the back side of this pressure plate, and the idea is when you hold the clutch in, it's enough brake to keep this from spinning so you don't grind the gears. So if you're having a problem grinding gears, you might want to A, make sure everything is adjusted, and B, make sure that these pads haven't worn to the point where it isn't breaking this. Now, how I adjust them is a little bit different than what everybody else online does. I like to slip a piece of paper right back here in this gap that's right in front of that little button in this pressure plate. And then as soon as I press down on the clutch, you'll see it kind of pulls this arm this way. And once the paper starts tearing when I pull on it, I know it's tight enough. And then when you relax it, I want to be able to slip this paper back down inside and not have any friction. So that's just how I do it, right or wrong, it works for me. And then the next thing is you need to adjust your clutch. So there's a couple of nuts down here, and you want to pull this rod. Now I pull it until it touches, and then I back it off just a hair so that it's not touching this bearing right here, the throwout bearing. So basically when your clutch is released, you don't want these fingers riding on the bearing, and when you have it all the way in, you can test it by keeping it in gear as I have, and you can see it does slip when I shove the clutch all the way in, and it grips when I let it off. And then I know my brake is also working because I did the paper test. So it's not that complicated. There's probably better procedures, but that's just how I do it. Now that's pretty much the job in a nutshell. Just remove the appropriate bolts to slide the engine this way, which will give you just enough room to slip in a new clutch plate and work on the clutch back here. Slide the engine back again, put all your bolts back in, tighten it up, and remember the gas tank is bolted to the engine, so you might want to loosen up the strap so the tank can slide a little bit. And also remember there's a couple of bolts in here, and you'll probably want to loosen the hydraulic lines, maybe even the fuel lines, so you have a little more wiggle room. And then put it all back together when you're done, and you're pretty much ready for another 10 years or so. Now, before you go, I want to tell you about the future progress of what's going to happen to the tractor that's sitting outside the garage. It's actually going to get some cool upgrades. I want to do a front loader, which also means we're going to reinforce the frame a bit because these do have a weak point on the frame. I also want to add power steering so that when we do have some weight in the front loader, we can steer a little easier. Now, that one out there also has a 3-point, so eventually we're going to build a little 3-point backhoe, which I think will also be a pretty cool project, and some other odds and ends for some upgrades that I think you'll find interesting. So like and subscribe, take a look at some of my other videos. You might find something you yourself might want to do.